Welcome to Film Forum Presents, a podcast featuring special live events recorded at our theater located at 209 West Houston Street in downtown Manhattan. In this episode, Film Forum presents a Q&A with author Elaine Mokhtefi following a screening of Gillo Pontecorvo's 1966 film The Battle of Algiers on May 24th, 2019. Elaine Mokhtefi is the author of a new book published by Verso Books, Algiers, Third World Capital, a memoir of her life in Algiers in the years following Algerian independence. Mohktefi, who also appears briefly in the film, introduced the screening on opening night of the 3-week festival The Hour of Liberation, Decolonizing Cinema 1966 to 1981. Following the film, she was joined by writer Elias Rodriques, who reviewed the book for The Nation. The Hour of Liberation runs through June 13th, with several more screenings of the Battle of Algiers. The festival was programmed by Repertory Associate Elspeth Carroll. Here's Elspeth to introduce the podcast.
Gillo Pontecorvo's 1966 masterpiece, The Battle of Algiers, was a natural choice to kick off our 3-week festival, The Hour of Liberation, Decolonizing Cinema 1966 to 81. Like many newly independent countries, Algeria quickly recognized the importance of cultivating a national cinema as a way to bolster national culture long suppressed under French colonial rule, and to write their own history on the world stage. In 1957, just 3 years after the FLN, the Algerian Liberation Front, declared its war of liberation against the French, the first Algerian film unit was established, which would become the Service du Cinéma National after independence. In 1974, Algiers was host to the first gathering of the Third World Filmmakers Meeting, a group that included Ousmane Sembène of Senegal, Med Hondo of Mauritania, Santiago Alvarez of Cuba, and Flora Gomez of Guinea-Bissau, all of whom are represented in our festival. In 1966, The Battle of Algiers, produced by and based on the memoirs of FLN leader Sadi Youssef, who also stars in the film, will go on to worldwide success and serve as a blueprint for anti-colonial filmmaking as well as urban guerrilla warfare the world over. Rialto Pictures' 2004 reissue of The Battle of Algiers, with a brand new translation and subtitles, introduced a whole new audience to the film. Since then, Rialto has worked closely with Sadi Youssef and his family. Mr. Youssef was most recently a guest at Film Forum in 2016. For our opening night screening of The Battle of Algiers, in a 4K digital restoration from Rialto, we were pleased to welcome Elaine Mokhtefi, author of Algiers, Third World Capital, published by Verso Books, a memoir of her time in Algiers after the War for Independence, when it was considered the liberation capital of the Third World, a haven for liberation movements from Angola to Vietnam. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Mohktefi crossed paths with some of the era's greatest anti-colonial thinkers. She was instrumental in the establishment of the international section of the Black Panther Party in Algiers. She was also present at the filming of the Battle of Algiers, in which she briefly appears. Today, Mohktefi lives just a subway ride away from Film Forum, on the Upper West Side. Following the film, Miss Mohktefi was joined in conversation by Elias Rodriques, a writer whose work has appeared in The Nation, N+1, and other publications. Please welcome Elaine Mokhtefi.
You're going to see a great, enduring film by one of the finest and most sensitive directors the cinema has given us, Gillo Pontecorvo. Perhaps some of you saw him in New York in March 1999 at the Lincoln Center Film Society when he was interviewed by Edward Said, the historian. My husband and I, alongside a large group of friends, were there. But I also saw Pontecorvo in action in Algiers in June 1965, 54 years ago, over half a century away. By then, Algeria was independent, and I was working at Algérie per Service, the Algerian National Press Agency. Someone appeared in the press room one morning and announced that there was a film being shot a few hundred feet from the agency, and they needed volunteers for the day. I shut up my hand. And so I got to see Pontecorvo at work, and miraculously, was part of a film that would become history, a reference for dedication to ideals and independence, an unstoppable process of liberation, as Pontecorvo called it. I have recently written a book called Algiers, Third World Capital, and especially it's especially about the time of that film, the 50s and 60s. The film, however, is my one claim to fame, though you will have to look quickly. You will see me at the press conference scene at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. I'll be there for a few seconds, dark-haired and 37 years old. This is the scene in which the military leader of the Algerian freedom fighters, Larbi Ben Mehidi, who has just been arrested, is presented to the press by a French colonel. In actual fact, Ben Mehidi was not presented to the press. But Pontecorvo wanted this fantastic man and this fantastic leader to be heard, and so incorporated him in the film in this way. The truth is that upon his arrest, Larbi Ben Mehidi was tortured and refused to talk. And then he was taken on orders from the French General Massu to a farm south of Algiers and hung twice. The rope broke the first time, and the French soldiers laughed as the hangman placed a second rope around his neck. His body was then transported to a hospital. The doctors, as well as the press, were told that he had committed suicide. Nothing was farther from the truth. I hope you enjoy the film.
Thanks, everyone, for sticking around. Thanks, Elaine, so much for inviting me. And thank you, everyone who put this on and made this happen. One of the things I was thinking about as we were watching the film this time was that in your book, you mentioned that the war was waged not just in Algeria, but also on the front page of the New York Times and the United Nations. And this is, of course, something that the general is thinking a lot about when he has the journalists there, and he's always trying to tell them how to tell the story. For those of us who haven't read your book, and for the record, everyone should read this book. It's phenomenal. Black Panther show up, Nina Simone makes a cameo, and it's about the Algerian War. It's great. But for those of us who haven't read your book, could you tell us maybe a little bit about what that other war was like, the war outside of Algeria, in the New York Times, in the UN, since you lived it and fought that war?
It's a big question. I think the Algerians were very aware that militarily they couldn't win. And as a result, they very quickly sought to gain support in the international arena. The war started actually in at the end of 1954, in December and November. In 1955, they showed up at an international conference called Bandung, which became quite famous. There were some leading people in the world who were present. There was Chu Enlai of China. There was Jawaharlal Nehru of India and Sukarno of Indonesia, the three of the foremost populated countries in the world. And they succeeded in passing a resolution in favor of Algerian independence. And then two of those men showed up in New York also in 1955, got support from UN delegations, particularly Arab delegations, to support the Algerian move for independence. They succeeded in opening an office in New York. I worked in that office, and in lobbying the UN year after year with an Algerian resolution for independence and an attack on France. And at the same time, Algerian delegations of students, of trade unionists, of youth attended international meetings, attempted to get resolutions passed in favor of Algerian independence. They also, at the same time, realized that other African countries needed experience other countries around the world needed experience. And so they started training within the Algerian military defenses inside Algeria. They started training militants, soldiers, and diplomatic personnel for their own struggles for independence. As a result, for example, Nelson Mandela spent weeks in Algerian training camps in the 1960s. He went back to South Africa. He was arrested and remained in prison for about 29 years. When he came out of prison, the first country he went to visit was Algeria. And he stood in the streets of Algiers with crowds around him screaming, "I'm Algerian." The Algerians, after all, were faced with the fourth military power in the world. And they started their fight, their struggle, with rusty rifles, scout knives, and empty cans of sardines that they filled with powder. And they were fighting, as I said, they were fighting the fourth military power in the world. And they knew that from the beginning that it would be a long and difficult fight. But they knew that it would be successful, and I think we see that in the film.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great answer. And maybe fast forwarding a little to when the film comes out and is being filmed. What was that like in Algiers at the time, where you were living? How did people react to the film? What does it look like to you today?
Algiers at the time, as I said, they had helped organize the military and diplomatic services of other countries before they attained their own independence. After independence, all of these different liberation organizations, whether they be the ANC of South Africa, or the ZAPU of Zimbabwe, or the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, they all set up in Algiers. They all had offices in Algiers, and were helped with their training in Algerian military camps. The Algerians remained very faithful to the idea of independence and solidarity. And it was a kind of expression of the times.
You mentioned just now that seeing the film still has you choked up whenever you watch it. What is it like watching the Battle of Algiers today?
Every time I see it, I'm overwhelmed. It's like the first time. I remember very well the day that I spent with the actors. And I remember Pontecorvo standing in the corner of a room on a kind of step ladder. And he had his eye on everything, even what we ate for lunch. And he never moved from that corner. He stood all day long. And he was a passionate observer of the Algerian scene. He wanted to show that war was difficult, but that independence was possible. And I think he did. This is a very moving moment for me to talk about it all. It's easier to write it. Algiers at the time, I mean, it was a difficult time in the 50s and 60s. There was a time when the United States was at war in Vietnam, and the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had embassies in Algiers at the time, and were very noticeable and very active participants in the Algerian scene, with the Palestinians and with the different movements, not only from the Portuguese colonies and the English-speaking colonies of Africa, but also all sorts of movements had set up offices. For example, the French Canadians, the Central Americans from Nicaragua and Honduras had offices in Algiers. It was a a gathering point. That's why my book is called The Capital of the Third World, whereas in French it's called going to be called Capital of the Revolution, which also reminds me that a film has been made about how this film that you just saw was made by an Algerian filmmaker called Malik Ben Smail. The technical and political input of the film is described. Interviews with Pontecorvo's widow are in the film, and it was shown at he was invited to Columbia University recently and had a showing of the film. It was a very exciting time, and during the film, imagine, during the film, while it was being shot, there was a coup d'etat in Algiers. Ben Bella was overthrown by Boumediene, who was his vice president and head of the army. But the film continued to be made, despite the fact that there was a coup d'etat.
Maybe my last question before we open it up for Q&A. It feels like it would be remiss, given the major political movement happening in Algeria in the past few months, to not talk about that.
Exciting, yes, extremely exciting. It's though people have sort of crawled out of the woodwork. Millions have come into the streets, and they've demanded a change of regime. And the president of Algeria, who was completely physically and mentally debilitated, was obliged after 4 terms to renounce, attempting to get a 5th term. His candidacy was dropped. People are still in the streets every Friday and asking for a complete change of regime in a country that once new revolution is trying for a second revolution. It's very exciting. There was once a French diplomat who used to tell his personnel, who was in the French embassy in Algiers, that you'll think you understand Algeria when you've been there for a while, but they will always surprise you. And I think they will surprise us now.
Thank you so much for being here. I feel so privileged to be able to be here tonight and listen to you. I had read a review of your book some months ago. I haven't yet read the book, but I definitely intend to. I wanted to know what you think is most important to share about the political philosophy of Pontecorvo, and also what do you think is most important to share about his methodology as a filmmaker?
Well, I think that Algeria in general wished for a socialist regime. They still have a lot of state industry, despite it all, and they the demonstrators that are out in the streets today are calling for a socialist type regime. The regime was originally based on self-management, which was a system that was tried in Yugoslavia and in Cuba. Their political philosophy was self-management, basically. They took over the oil industry, but over the years, of course, this has been weakened, and there's been a lot of private enterprise and trade agreements with countries in Europe and the United States. There's a big sale of Algerian gas to the United States.
So my question is French out or not? Is France still in Algeria or not? My question is not, because nowadays they are using other courses of colonialism and neocolonialism. This is what brings us to the La France Algérie, or what the new France in Algeria, or France Afrique. People might know that there are some countries in Africa nowadays, they're still using currencies that are printed in France.
Yes, well, the French have never ceased, or France has never ceased affecting Algeria. They have attempted over the years to become closer. The recent president of France has actually said that French colonialism was abominable. He said that in Algeria, Macron. There's a definite attempt for France and Algeria to get along. France is the major trade partner of Algeria. Most of Algerians speak some French, though it is no longer the national language. It is taught and spoken by most people. France is also one of the places that Algerians emigrate to. I think their relationship remains difficult, but strong. In both countries, both in Algeria and in France, this war's real activity, the realistic side of this war is not taught in the schools. There's tremendous ignorance as to the 132 years of French colonialism, the fact that 90% of Algerians at the time of independence were illiterate. That can be seen clearly in the film. That they were poor, they were the object of racism, of violence, of poverty, of a stolen country. But nevertheless, French influence is still strong, and it is still one of the of Algeria's main problems.
Can you say more about Pontecorvo in terms of what you know about him? I don't know if you know
about what?
Pontecorvo, the director. Can you say more about him, about his involvement?
Well, I mean, I saw him for one day, but I thought he was amazing. He was on top of everything. He was had been a member of the Communist Party for a long time. He left the party in the 50s, but Solanas, with whom he made the film, remained a member of the Communist Party. He was very much a musician, and as you can see from the music in the film, he was very much a part of the choosing with Morricone, who became a very, very important Italian musical director for film. He shared the billing with Morricone for the music in the film. He also had to make the decision, important decision, of whether he would continue the film after the coup d'etat, and he did. He kept on working as though nothing had happened. All of his films have shown that he's a man who was for the freedom of the nation and the freedom of the individual. He was quite admirable. Unfortunately, he was an elderly man when he came to the United States and spoke at the Lincoln Center with Edward Said. But he was still quite militant and very proud of his work. I always had retained a very strong impression of him because he was so domineered that room that we were all in for that press conference. He was in charge. He had his eye on the lighting. He had his eye on the acting. He had his eye on the food. He had his eye on the positioning of each person, of the choosing of the faces that he was going to emphasize and so on. He was quite amazing.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks so much. This is great.
Thank you for listening to Film Forum Presents. Special thanks to Rialto Pictures and Verso Books for making this event possible. If you like what you just heard, please be sure to subscribe to get future episodes and rate and review so that more movie lovers can find us. Film Forum is an independent nonprofit cinema, and our doors have been kept open for nearly 50 years thanks to the invaluable support of our members and donors. Please visit www.filmforum.org for details on membership, as well as information and showtimes for our current programming. See you at the movies.